Thank you ever so much for inviting me. It's a really strange talk to give because the only sort of thing that I can say is really what happened to me. And one thing about the Future Fellowship is that everyone that I've talked to or that gave me advice that got one slightly differently. So I'm just going to do the only thing that I can do, which is to tell you what my own journey was like. But I do want to really stress at the beginning that yours won't be exactly like this. And that's as it should be. So I'm not sort of trying to share a blueprint. I'm just saying what happened to me. And hopefully some of that might be somewhat useful for you guys as you think through how you're going to navigate this journey. However, I do think there are things that made a really big difference that if I hadn't known about them, I probably wouldn't have got a fellowship. And those are the things that I really want to focus on today, the things that I think are transferable and that, as far as I can tell, did make a big difference for me. I think a lot of what I'm going to say might sound really naive, and that's just because I'm not pretending like I was really naive when I started off on this journey. And so I'm going to say that and not pretend that I knew what I was doing from the beginning. So if I say stuff and you think, yeah, I know that already, that's because I didn't when I started. Before I got into the sort of whole grant writing thing, I arrived at Monash in 2011. I've been in the UK previously, as you can probably tell by my accent, and I'd never applied for a grant. So the whole thing was new to me. When I learned that there was this thing called a Future Fellowship that would give you 4 years worth of funding, I thought that this was how you did it. You started from zero, you're a lone ranger, and in 1 year you write a brilliant application and you end up with a Future Fellowship. And I very soon found out, as I'm sure you guys already know, that that's very much not how it works. And a number of different things came in to disabuse me of that idea, but also to help me see how these things do work and how I can meaningfully apply for a fellowship. And these are the 5 things that I think made a difference for me. The first one was a good mentor. And I've put this first because I think it made the biggest difference. I found someone in my faculty, first of all, who did something pretty similar to me. So I work in contemporary French philosophy, and so does she. So she knew how my field worked. She knew the sort of language that people use within my specific subfield. But she also, and I think this was incredibly crucial, she knew how the ARC worked. She had a strong record herself. She got DPs, and then she had a Future Fellowship herself. She also happened to be the faculty research coordinator. So I guess that was just lucky that a person in my area happened to be the research deputy dean at the time. And her input was an absolute game changer in that I would write something that I thought sounded really good. And then she would come back and say to me, yeah, that's just not what the ARC want to hear. That's useful for people in your area, but nobody cares about that if they're not doing French philosophy, which was a bit of a bruise to my ego. But I needed to know that because I was writing for me and I wasn't writing for the ARC. And she helped me to know what the difference is between those two. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a moment. She was also incredibly useful because she didn't just praise me. I had a couple of mentors who I would send stuff to, and they'd always say it was great. And I knew it wasn't. And I just wanted someone to tell me what was wrong with it. And it hurts to hear what's wrong with our writing, doesn't it? But from the first bit of feedback I got from her, I knew that she was the real deal because she told me, yeah, this bit's good, that bit's bad, this bit's middling, you need to change this, this, and this. And I thought, wow, okay, you know what you're talking about. And of course, she gave positive feedback too. It wasn't a bloodbath every time. So finding the right mentor, I think, would be the first thing that really made a difference to me. And that's what I would look for. If I was looking for another mentor, it's those categories that I would look for. Getting a little grant. So I naively thought I could go from nothing to a Future Fellowship in one go, which of course, if it has been done, I've never heard of it being done. And so I applied for little $9,000, $10,000 grants just to get something of a track record in winning money and in writing grant applications. Now, I only managed to get one $9,000 grant and one $20,000 grant before the Future Fellowship, but at least it had been some sort of practice, and I could prove to the ARC that I could not only win money, but then when I'd done it, I could deliver on what I promised. And it just proves that I'm able to do what I say that I'll do with a little bit of money, and hopefully then to show them that I can do what I promise with a bit more money. Practice, failure, and long-term view is the third one. I just found it incredibly helpful from setting out applying for future fellowships to think of it as a 3-year exercise. So now you get 3 shots at these. It used to be 2, but the ARC have upped it to 3. And from the beginning, I thought the third one is going to be the one where I'm really competitive. And the other 2 are going to be learning exercises. Where I'm trying to make each one better than the one before. And that just meant that when the first one absolutely crashed and burned, as I'm going to show you in a minute, it wasn't as if the whole project was worthless. Like, I was always expecting it to do that. And then I was going to use that as a learning exercise for the second one and the third one. Reading past successful grants. This was also really crucial for me because there's a certain way of writing for the ARC and a certain language and idiom that successful applications use that unless I'd read a bunch of them, I just didn't know what it was. So I was writing as I would write, but I needed to learn to speak ARC and learn to write at that level of language that the ARC like. And so I managed to get 2 full grant applications, like the whole thing, page 1 to the final page, for 2 people who were close enough to my area to speak the same sort of language that I did. And I think, as far as I can tell, that was pretty game-changing. Because it taught me how to speak about what I do in a way that the ARC can understand. And that's what I couldn't do previously. One of them was my mentor, but the other one was just someone I knew from my area who worked at a different university in Australia. And I just wrote to him and I said, hey, congratulations on your future fellowship. What do you think about letting me have a look at your application? Because I'm applying for one myself. And being, the kind guy that he is, he said, yeah, sure. And he sent me the whole thing. My research office has some little sections that they have on their website. So, section D from 2 or 3 people, but they weren't close enough to my area and they weren't the full application. So I couldn't see how it flowed through from beginning to end. So I would really recommend having a look on the ARC website at past successful applications, finding the 1 or 2 that are closest to what you do, and just having a punt and emailing the people and saying, hey, wonderful that you've got a future fellowship. I'm applying for one. This might sound weird, but would you mind sending me your full application? And the worst that can happen is that they say no, and you haven't lost anything, and you might even get a full application that's close to your area, which is real gold dust in my experience. And fifthly, allocating serious time. I didn't realize how long one of these things takes when I started off. It ended up being pretty much an all-consuming exercise for a full semester for me. And I would say it was about the equivalent of a couple of articles, probably 3 articles. In other words, don't think you can knock it off in the evenings over a couple of weeks. I'm sure none of you do. But it takes months, it takes iterations, it takes, hundreds of hours perhaps of preparation. And I think if I hadn't budgeted for that, and if my teaching hadn't allowed it in that particular semester, which just happened to be the case for me, then I think I would have really struggled to give it the attention that it needed to fine-tune it to the state where it was competitive. So this is what I ended up doing. This was my trajectory from getting no grant money to getting a future fellowship in the end. So in 2012, I applied for a failed discovery project as a lone ranger. And that was disastrous. I really didn't know what I was doing. By 2014, I'd learned that I needed to collaborate with other people. And so I applied for another one, which failed. In 2016, I applied to the Australian Research Theology Foundation, Inc., for a tiny little $9,000 grant to produce some videos, which I was fortunate enough to get. And that was my first ever grant success. That was, as you can imagine, really exciting at the time. And that was then a stepping stone in 2019 to apply for a Monash Warwick partnership grant, which was $19,000 to host a seminar series and then produce a book after it, which I was mentored for, which made a big difference, and it was collaborative. There was also a Fail Future Fellowship in 2019 that I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. And then 2020 was the year of the successful Future Fellowship, but also more failure in that year as well. I applied for a Templeton grant, which I didn't get. And I guess part of the reason for putting that slide up is just to show that there are islands of success in a sea of failure. And also that it was an iterative process. I learned I needed to collaborate. I learned I needed a mentor, and I gradually was able to improve over time. But from the beginning, I was hopeless. I don't mind admitting that. This was just as a word of encouragement. This was my result from the Future Fellowship 19, the one that I failed. I was in the third quartile of candidates for my own performance, the bottom 25% of unsuccessful candidates for the project, the third quartile for feasibility, and the bottom 25% for benefit. So safe to say, not close to getting it in 2019. And yet in 2020, I got one. So what do I read into that? I think part of it is that the way you write the grant is really important. So the topic changed a lot from 2019 to 2020, but I didn't. I still had the same track record. And yet they can put me in the third quartile in 2019 and I can get one in 2020. And I think what I learned in the meantime was how to present myself more and how to tell my own story. And I think this slide shows that makes a big difference. It's not only how good we are, it's how well we can communicate about how good we are. That's really, really important. The mentor again was key in that. Reading other people's candidate sections was really key for that, for me. Finding a topic was a really, really big deal because the sort of philosophy that I do isn't very popular and isn't very interesting to anyone apart from the small handful of us who do it. So the left-hand part of the Venn diagram there is the sort of stuff I do. The reception of Heideggerian Mitsein in recent French thought is not going to get many people out of bed in the morning. Ontology in the writing of Jean-Luc Nancy. This is what people like me live for. But I'm sure that you and the other 99.9% of the population, not to put too fine a point on it, couldn't care less. So that was the sort of thing that I was pitching right at the beginning. Let me tell you about this great philosopher. And then everybody was like, who cares? Now, but it's important. They didn't bite. So what I looked at was the sort of projects that got up, but they were all so far away from what I did. It was like all the sciences and the biologists and the medics, do vaccines cause blood clots, climate change, artificial intelligence. And I thought, that's just not what I do. Like, how can I compete with people who are curing cancer because I do these obscure French philosophers? And what my mentor helped me to do was find a sweet spot that's enough of what I do for me to be an expert on it, but enough of what people are interested in for people outside my area to care. And the suggestion that she made that ended up being the winning suggestion was the idea of the social contract. So it's got a big history in French philosophy. I can credibly say that as a French philosopher, I know a bunch of stuff about this, but it's also really important socially. People are talking about it with COVID and climate change and so forth. And it's a word people understand outside my area. And finding that term, finding the social contract was absolutely key in preparing the FT20 that ended up being successful. But it was only about halfway through the process that she suggested it to me. So I started off writing about freedom, and I was trying to build a project around freedom, and I wasn't satisfied with it. She wasn't satisfied with it. And there was one paragraph in that application on the social contract. And one piece of feedback she gave to me was, it'd be really interesting if you made that the whole project. My heart sank because it would mean completely scrapping weeks of work and doing it again. But I could see what she meant. Like, it is a really interesting idea. And so I bit the bullet, drank lots of coffee, and rewrote the whole thing. But I don't think we'd have got there if I hadn't done all the work on freedom first, and if that hadn't all been put in the bin. And that's part of why I think it just takes a lot of time, that your first idea might not be the one you end up with, but you've got to give yourself the time to go through those stages. In deciding on a topic, I think this is what I learned. Will someone from the ABC conceivably interview you on this topic? And if the answer is no, then it's probably not broad enough. Could you conceivably think of writing an article for The Age on it? And again, if no, then you're probably not thinking widely enough. It's not a broad enough interest area. I think in terms of pitching the topic, that the advice that I was given that was really helpful was it should be close enough to what you do for you to be an expert on it, for you to build a credible case that you are the person to do this. But it should also be a step change and a pivot in your research trajectory. It should be markedly different to what you've done before. So if the ARC see a future fellowship application where it's just more of the stuff you've already done, they will say, well, why are we going to fund that? You're already doing that. It should be, I've so far done this, this, and this, but now I've come to the point where I want to upscale, or whatever language you want to use, my research. I'm ready to take the next step. I want to think bigger, and this is now the new project. And so there should be a clear distinction between the work you've done so far and the future fellowship project. It should be a bigger vision for your research. Drafting. This is just the Windows document folder with all the drafts of section D for the successful one, just to give a sense of how much drafting went into it and how many times this darn thing was rewritten from beginning to end. And just to give a sense, I guess, of how much time that would have taken. In drafting it, I think expression and language really count. It's not just the idea, it's how we talk about it. Because the reviewers are tired and pressured and bored probably and want to get to their own research, and they're reading 10 of these in an evening and just want to get through them. And so something that we do has to stand out. It either has to be elegantly written or have punchy statistics or arresting formulations or a really captivating metaphor. And also just to be incredibly clear. I think if the assessors have to do any work to work out what we're saying, they're probably going to phase out. And so clarity and interest, I think, are the two things that I learned in terms of drafting. In terms of pitch, I guess imagine that we're writing for the conversation. So an educated audience, but that are not particularly interested, in my case, in French philosophy, or in your case, in education. That's not what's going to get them excited. Anything to do with education is probably not what's going to tip the balance in your favor. It's got to be something that education helps us to understand about broader society, or some topic that lots of people in society are interested in that education can help us to speak into. And one piece of advice I remember getting that's always stuck with me, and that's something that I use in my own drafting, is someone said to me once, what makes your project sparkle? And I just found that a helpful metaphor. What makes it, I guess they're meaning exciting, engaging, sort of above the norm of these applications. Where's its energy? Where's its emotion? Not just how is it accurate and pertinent, but why is it exciting, I guess. And I found that helpful in the drafting. Other important details, I learned to my detriment to choose FOR codes really, really carefully. So now the ARC use a word cloud to assign assessors, but they also use your FOR codes. And I made a particular mistake that's sort of specific to my field that won't make much sense to you, but I chose the wrong FOR codes one year. I got massacred. I got absolutely bludgeoned in the assessor reports because I wasn't doing the sort of work that they thought was important. And then the next year, I tried to learn from that and chose different FOR codes and got much better reviews. And the lesson I drew from that was that it's not just what I write, it's who I try and get it in front of that's really important, and choosing the right FOR codes is key. In terms of my own track record. I think it was important. An important moment for me was when I realized that I can't compete with everyone on everything, that I'm just not as, not got as much impact as most people, and I've not got as much community engagement as most people. And I don't have as much international collaboration as most people, but I've got a really good publication record. And so rather than trying to pretend that I was really, really good at everything, I tried to tailor the candidate section more to my own strengths and to show how those strengths spilled over into other areas, and to talk about everything, but not to pretend that I was better than I was in areas where it's clear that I wasn't that good in the end. And the final thing to say is that I genuinely had no expectation of getting one. I applied because the faculty put pressure on us to apply for grants, and quite legitimately in the current climate. And so I thought, okay, I'll go for this one because if I get it, it'll be great. And if that pressure hadn't been there, and if I hadn't have applied, I wouldn't have got it. So just to encourage you guys, you'll never know if you don't apply. So however remote you think it is, I just have a punt and see where it takes you. Thank you.